I said earlier, I came to Johns Hopkins in 1985, and I moved to Johns Hopkins from Northern California. So I was living in Northern California when HIV hit. And in Northern California, it hit big. And I knew a lot of people who were either truly personally affected by what came to be known as HIV, or who were sort of working for the cause. In San Francisco at the time, it really felt like our equivalent to the civil rights movement. It was HIV at the time was really thought of as a gay disease. It was only a few years later that it was also recognized to be prominent in people who were using injection drugs. And in the 80s, it was just thought of as a gay disease. And gay people were dying and nobody knew why. And again, in the early 80s, there wasn't even a test yet. The virus hadn't been identified. And when I moved to Johns Hopkins for graduate school, I took all the public health and research and health services and health policy classes that everybody else took and loved them. But when I wanted to get my first part-time job, which later evolved into 2 years later the same study with which I did my doctoral dissertation research, I very deliberately wanted to work on an HIV/AIDS research study. And I had the remarkable good fortune to work for what was called the SHARE study, the study to help the AIDS research effort, which was the Baltimore site of a 4-site multi-center study called the Multi-Center AIDS Cohort Study, the MAC study, which was really one of the first large HIV cohort studies that was funded by the NIH. Frank Polk, who is unfortunately no longer alive, led the Baltimore site. And I will say that in those days, in the 80s, HIV felt like a hybrid of a public health problem and a political movement. And I gravitated toward both of those pieces. I became very involved for years in a nonprofit volunteer effort in Baltimore called the AIDS Legislative Committee. It wasn't affiliated with Johns Hopkins, but many of us, most of whom had professional backgrounds, a lot of lawyers and doctors and social workers, came together once a week on Thursdays from 7 to 10 and looked to see what was going to be happening in the Maryland legislature. And in those days, there were horrible things. There were toe tag bills. There were people wanting to HIV test every possible population. And our job was to anticipate legislation, write legislation, do grassroots mailing campaign, and try to raise $10,000 for a part-time lobbyist. And we did that for years. And HIV was just a big focus of my life, so it was very natural for me that it would be the focus of my dissertation. And it was the focus of my research for easily the first 5 years I was on the faculty. My dissertation was on access to health insurance for gay and bisexual men, and I interviewed about, you would think I would remember, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 gay men to find out what their access to health insurance had been and some questions about discrimination. And there was really a sense, which I think is true in so many political movements, that, and maybe particularly in a small state like Maryland, that individual efforts can make a difference. And there were remarkable grassroots and nonprofit efforts going on all over Baltimore, the way I'm sure there were in other places. I was so far from alone. I mean, there were so many other people who were beginning to do HIV work at Johns Hopkins who had exactly the same sympathies and sentiments and commitments. And again, it really felt like a political movement to try to get research done as fast as possible. So.